So the question has been set. What will happen with King David? Is he going to rise to the expectations that the Duramistic historians have set up for him? Or is he going to fall in much the same way as Saul does? Or will his fate be somewhere in between the two? David is such a compelling character and an excellent character to study because he's so dynamic. There's so much to him. He wrestles with his faith. He wrestles with the circumstances that go on around him. It's because of this that he's a character that people have been so drawn to since the ancient Near East. Many books and songs, films have been written on King David because he is such a complex individual. David feels deeply and he acts with gusto. So, I hope you enjoy this section on King David. One of the roles of King David that we've already discussed in The Light of David the Boy was a poet. His poetry and music in the ancient Near East were one and the same, and David, during his time before king, was able to quell the evil spirit that plagued King Saul. He continues to write and compose poems as a part of his life. The Psalms, the book of Psalms, in fact, are attributed to David. Now, not all of them are David's. Some of them are specifically the Psalms of other people. And we don't know how many of the other ones actually were written by a King David or were attributed to David due to the greatness of his memory. But the Psalms are attributed to him, which is a huge honor. David also continues his work as a gifted warrior and military tactician. In his youth, killing Goliath by using piety and wit. Later on, he's able to be very effective in this regard by banding mercenaries together. He's good at getting hired swords to fight with him and tactfully, or tactically, maybe it was tactful as well, but using good tactics and all of that, and it makes him a real force to be reckoned with. The Philistines suffer greatly at David's hand at different times. He also kills off the remnant of Saul's supporters. So, at the end of 1 Samuel, we find Saul killed along with all of his sons. Well, in 2 Samuel, lo and behold, magically another son appears. Why is this? It's because we've got oral traditions going and they smash together into the Bible here. And as other places, the compilers and editors didn't seem bothered to remove it. Again, they're not going for accuracy. But the son shows up and wages war against David for the throne, and he has his supporters, David has his supporters, and David kills off his rival supporters and eventually defeats his enemy. This shows us a few things. It shows us a transition. Now that David is king, he's no longer the shepherd boy with his harp. This is a man who is willing to have blood on his hands. This is a man who's willing to do dirty deeds to get end results. So we see a shift here that happens, and that might be telling about what happens to people when they go from being youth to being people of power. Henry VIII, for example, the English king, who was such a bloody king later in his life, was known for his love poetry as a youth and for his idealism. After taking the throne, well, not only did he kill his enemies, but his wives as well. Within this, there's a story that exemplifies how David could be ruthless when he felt he needed to. The enemy, Saul's mystery son, has two officers that abandon him to help David, and they come to David and they give him information, and expecting a reward, they get a nasty surprise. David has his guards kill them. Why? They just helped him. They switched sides to help David win this war. Well, because you can't trust a traitor, and so rather than keeping them alive, David has them put to death immediately. David is also a highly, highly effective politician. He's able to brilliantly keep the Philistines and Canaanites and Israelites doing what he needed them to do. If he wanted peace, he could coax them into peace. If he wanted war, he could coax them into war. Sometimes double talking behind backs here and there to get things where they were going. Being an effective politician is the ability to manipulate large groups of people. If you're a benevolent politician, it's for their own good, or at least that's what your thought is. He tends to be a benevolent politician, but we'll get more into that in a little bit. But nonetheless, he proves himself very effective. He is also able to become king immediately after Saul's death. There's no question until that other thread of narrative comes in with Saul's mystery son. And David's massive popularity and the killing off of Saul's loyalists allows him to be king of the northern tribes as well. In the tribal confederation that was during the Judges, you have a cultural rift between the north and the south. And David's a southerner. He's from what will become Judah, with the capital of Jerusalem. But he's able to get the northerners to get on board in a way that Saul simply couldn't. And he's also an effective politician in much the same way that the prophet Samuel failed miserably at being. People listen to David. People trust David. And very important, along with being a warrior and politician, he got things done. David was excellent at getting people to do what he wanted them to do, as mentioned in the previous slide. And one of these great accomplishments, as I mentioned before, was the tribal unity. In so many ways, Yahweh was with David, and the promise appears to be all but fulfilled. They've got land, they've got descendants, and they sure as shootin' seem to be blessed, just as God had told David's ancestor Abraham would be the case. Now we get to the dangerous territory. Now we get back to the whole question, David, David, he's our man. If he can't do it, no one can. Sadly, David is going to fall to the same pride and arrogance that Saul does. And this time for the reader, it's more painful. Saul started out as a nitwit, right? Remember, he had lost his dad's goats when he came upon Samuel and was tapped to be the first king of Israel. But David was so good. David was so pure. And we learn something really important for the Judaistic historian perspective here. They were giving a stark warning that no matter how good of a person you are, no matter how pious or what inner purity, whatever that is, you might possess, you're subject to the corroding, corruptive forces of power. And this is going to come into stark view with the story of David and Bathsheba. The story of David and Bathsheba is one that has inspired artists, authors, and, as we see here, filmmakers. We've got the Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward 1950s film David and Bathsheba, and then the later 1980s King of David film with Richard Gere. Both of these films I show in my Bible and film course. The story of David and Bathsheba is a story of adultery, a story of betrayal, and a story of many other things as well. What I want to point out here is especially the Gregory Peck Susan Hayward poster, where David is standing with his chest out, very in a masculine, commanding sort of way, and Bathsheba appears to be beckoning him down onto her bed. Bathsheba throughout history has been portrayed as a seductress. In this lesson, I'm going to argue strongly against that betrayal, and I think that betrayal comes from some really problematic, misogynistic ideas within Western cultures. At any rate, we'll get into that in a little bit. Let's jump into the story of David and Bathsheba. Please take out your Bibles and turn to 2 Samuel, verse 11. 2 Samuel, chapter 11, and I'll meet you there at the next slide. I'm going to read this part of the story to you. Chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Now, let's just start with this part of the story. This is very problematic. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. In the ancient world, the kings went out to battle with their troops. Unlike today, in the Iraq War, President Bush wasn't out there. In the fight against ISIS, President Obama isn't out there. And for very good reason, right? We keep them in a safe area where they can continue their democratic duties of leading. But in the ancient world, a king really put his money where his mouth was. And if they went to war, he was expected to be there in the battle. But here's David at home while his troops are out there fighting in his name. This, from the very outset to the ancient reader, would be disgraceful. So, let's see what he was up to while he was at home. Verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on a roof of the king's house. On the roof of the king's house. And he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Holy moly, there is a lot to unpack in this small bit of text. First of all, we get the answer to what David was doing. While the men were out at battle, he was creeping at the ladies, right? So they're out fighting the battles for him, and he's on his rooftop voyeuring at all the women as they take baths on their lower roofs. They're on their roofs to avoid being in the view of others, but he has the highest roof, so he can take that right of privacy away from them. Not only that, but it's his soldiers' wives who are fighting and dying, upon which he is creeping. This is very disgusting and would also be seen as highly disgraceful in the ancient Near Eastern context. We see David's stock plummeting very quickly in this story, and it's going to get worse. As you can see, it doesn't end there. He has Bathsheba come to his home, and he has sex with her. They point out that very personal bit of information that she had just been cleansing herself after a period to give the reader or the listener, in the oral tradition sense, no doubt that the child is David's. It's not that Uriah the Hittite had sex with his wife before going off to battle. No, she had just had her period. Also a very fertile time for women, so David has impregnated her. And she has sent him word of this. But it doesn't stop there. Let's unpack this a little bit. Okay, first of all, he's gotten one of his soldiers who's fighting for him, the wife pregnant, a soldier who is not a Hebrew. I'm not sure if Bathsheba was a Hebrew or not, but that could be problematic as well if the heir to the throne isn't going to be from the line of Abraham at this point in ancient Hebrew religious history. And going back to the posters of the previous slide, or especially the Susan Hayward image in that one poster, what's Bathsheba's attitude within all this? What's Bathsheba experiencing? The ancient authors didn't let us in on that. This could probably be because the ancient authors didn't see as women as having any control over their sexuality, which women didn't in the ancient world. A law certainly was being broken here. You couldn't sleep with another man's wife. This was so key in ancient Near Eastern context because such a large part of what was important to you was your lineage, the bloodline that you passed down. And here, David has stepped into that bloodline and taken it over. This is a major insult and offense to Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba. But getting back to Bathsheba, what has happened to her? It doesn't say she was willing, and it does not say she's not willing. But did she have a choice? Here you have a woman married to a foreign man who's serving in the military, probably a mercenary, and David decides he wants to sleep with her, brings her to the palace, and has sex with her. Did she have a choice? This raises a lot of uncomfortable questions about David. Could Bathsheba have said no? I highly doubt she had that power. One, a woman didn't have control of her sexuality, although she did have some power in this sense, in that she was a married woman. But how would she exert that power? What might happen if she said no? To the king who is in control of her husband, who is a warrior. He could have had her killed. He could have had her husband killed. There's no end of things that David could have done because of his position of power, and power matters. I'll give you an example. I'm an Episcopal priest, right? And when I was in seminary, the bishop in Toronto came to talk to us about the laws of relationships with parishioners, because in the Episcopal Church, we can marry. Basically, it sets out like this. If I was to take a position in a church and was attracted to one of my parishioners and she was attracted to me, this was the protocol that we would have to go through. First, either she or I would have to leave the church, meaning she would have to leave a church that she might have grown up in and was part of her community her whole life. Or I would have to leave my job. That's step one. Step two, after reporting to the bishop, we would need to put our relationship on ice for 7 years. Imagine walking up to say to someone that you've met recently and said, you know, I really like hanging out with you, and I'd like to take you out to a movie. Should we see what's playing, say, in 7 years from now? What's going to happen to that relationship? It's going to kill it, right? And that's the idea. Now, all the bishops I've come into contact and served under have been very nice people. Why would they want to kill a relationship? It's because of the power dynamic between a priest and a parishioner. If I start out in the relationship as the priest figure, does that ever fully go away? Someday down the line when we're deciding how many kids we want to have, someday down the line when we're deciding what house we're going to buy, someday down the line when we decide how much we're going to save for retirement, is that going to play a role in the decision-making process? Since we can't know for sure, the Episcopal Church just takes it out of the equation and basically makes it next to forbidden. Now let's get back to this king who has control over life and death. And he says, I want to sleep with you. What's she going to say? Ultimately, Bathsheba really doesn't have a choice, or if she does have a choice, it could very well be between yes and death for her and possibly her husband. David should have known this. David should have seen the power dynamic, and maybe he did. But whether he did or not, in ancient standards, it wouldn't have been the case. But in modern standards, this is really no different than sleeping with an intoxicated woman, with sleeping with a woman who's passed out and can't exert her rights. In essence, it can be argued, and I argue, David raped Bathsheba. If she doesn't have full control to say no to the situation, the power is taken away from her. Even if she said yes, it's like an intoxicated person saying yes. It doesn't count because you're not in full control of your will. And she certainly wasn't in this situation, and David should have recognized that. We might all have different ideas on how we see the story in this context, but to lay it all out on the table, that's how I see the situation. So what's the right thing to do? What should David from 1 Samuel, who wouldn't have gone to this position in the first place, but what would David of 1 Samuel have done if he suddenly became cognizant in this part of the story? Confess. Ask God for forgiveness. Ask Bathsheba for forgiveness. Ask Uriah for forgiveness. Ask the people for forgiveness. That is what he should do. But he's not going to. David has already crossed over the abyss. But instead of trying to find a way to step back, he's going to go further in. And why? Why wouldn't he confess? Well, Uriah might try to kill him. His people might reject him. He might be thrown out of power, and maybe he deserves to be thrown out of power here. But that's the consequence he should be willing to face at this point of the story. Think of all the capital T truths we can pull out of this. How many of us have been in a situation where we should have done the right thing and we didn't, and it just made matters worse? I know I have. How many of us can think of situations where someone has had it all, like David did? The promise had been fulfilled. He had the power, he had the popularity, he had everything that he could have wanted, but he had to take yet more. Again, these stories aren't necessarily about David. They're not about the Hebrews. They're not about the Hittites. They're about us. These are stories that we can relate to. So let's see what David does next in the sequence of errors. Next, we have an attempted cover-up. Verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel are in and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I would not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence, and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. All right, just as a disclaimer, power just went out in this part of Davenport, so now I am doing this in a windowless room in the dark, and I've got a flashlight with which I'm reading the Bible. So if I'm slow here a bit on the draw, you know why. But within this story, David has decided that he's going to go forward and try to cover things up. As we see in that part that I just read, he brings Uriah the Hittite home from battle in an attempt to coerce him to go down and have sex with his wife. It's a good plan. He has sex with his wife. They're pregnant. Hey, congratulations. And Uriah is never the wiser. This is extremely devious, not just on the surface, but in the ancient Near Eastern context. In this case, David certainly would be inserting his line into Uriah's line, which would be a grotesque offense, as if all the other offenses aren't bad enough to start with. This downward spiral that David's on is quite staggering. And furthermore, he's very explicit about what he wants Uriah to do. In verse 8, David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Feet is a euphemism in ancient Hebrew literature for one's penis. So he's literally telling him to go home and have sex with Bathsheba. And here we see a major contrast between David and Uriah. David is being sinister. David is conniving. David is criminal. And the more so David is, the more Uriah is lifted up. Uriah does not go home to wash his feet. Uriah acts like David would have acted in 1 Samuel. How dare I even consider going home to sleep with my wife, to enjoy sexual pleasure while my men are out in the field, while my brothers in arms are in tents and dying in your name? Surely as you are alive and surely as your soul lives, I would never do such a thing. David sees that this plan isn't going to work as easily as he had hoped. So it progresses from there. David has him up for a meal and gets him drunk. This is even more sinister. Now he's trying to get Uriah drunk, so maybe with that, his morals will go down a peg or two, and then he'll go home and sleep with his wife and help to cover up the mess that David has created. But again, even in his drunken stupor, Uriah refuses to go home to sleep with his wife Bathsheba and goes to sleep along next to the servants. There's a question that arises in my mind here. Does Uriah know what's going on? Is Uriah savvy as to what has happened? I don't know. The author doesn't give us that information. This, again, is the beautiful ambiguity of the Bible. We can read the story in so many different ways, and my goodness, we could fill a year having conversations about all the facets of this story. But one thing hints to me that he might, because where does he go to sleep? He sleeps among the servants. The servants in the gate. The servants who, no matter where they work in the palace, know the going-ons. They know who comes in and out. I could imagine one of those servants saying to Uriah, look, man, I'm going to do you a solid here. Bathsheba, your wife, came in here, and she looked really upset when she left. Something's up. If that's the case, that completely changes the power dynamic of this situation. David's not in power at all. Uriah's in power. I could imagine if this is the case, Uriah is saying, I know what you're, in his mind, I know what you're up to. I know what you're getting at here, and I'm not going to be your patsy. I'm not going to let you walk away from this sin. I'm going to let you stew in this, and you're going to go down for it. And if it means my death, so be it. In fact, it is going to be Uriah's death. Let's go to the next slide. David orders a hit. If you would, please pause here and read on your own chapter 11, verses 14 to 27. After you're done, please unpause the slideshow and we'll continue. All right, you see what takes place. After David couldn't cover up his crime by having Uriah sleep with his wife, he chooses to have Uriah taken down. And what's more, he's so cold, he has Uriah deliver the order himself in a sealed message. Uriah is put up near the front of the fighting as David had ordered, and the troops pull back and let him fall in battle. But not only him, there would have been others as well. David is guilty of Uriah's death and also the deaths of other innocent soldiers who have been put in harm's way in order to cover up David's tracks. The sins just compile and compile and compile. But now with Uriah dead, David can marry Bathsheba, and hey, what a surprise, we got pregnant early, and his sin is covered up. A few years ago, I was at one of my son's friends' birthday parties. And during the party, I was talking with the other parents. A lot of them I didn't know, just children that my son was at school with. And there was this one mother there with a little baby. And I was talking to her about the baby. I said, well, what's his name? And she said, Uriah. And I stopped. I thought, wow, what do I say now? And she said to me, you're a biblical scholar, aren't you? My husband and I learned that it's a biblical name. We just like the sound of it. Who was Uriah? I thought, oh my, how do I answer this? But luckily, some inspiration came to me. And I said, a great hero, a really great hero. And I stand by that. I see Uriah as a hero in the story, especially if he knew what was going on. Uriah is a person who stood up to power. Uriah is a person that made a king atone for what this king had done. And there's a real power in that. At any rate, David has ordered the hit, it has gone down, and Uriah is dead. Uriah, perhaps, if he knew what was going on, attempted to make David atone or face the music. And David most certainly will face the music for what he has done. At this point, David must be pretty smug, or maybe I'm projecting that on him. At any rate, David must feel pretty confident that he's gotten away with it. He's married to Bathsheba, they're having a son. This is all turning up the best way he could possibly have expected. But that's all going to change when the prophet Nathan visits him. Now, prophets, as we're going to be learning about soon in this course, have two main jobs, speaking God's truth and speaking truth to power. And Nathan is a good prophet. His name in Hebrew means comes from the verb root to give. Nathan is going to give a prophecy that will horrify David. Let's take a look at it in chapter 12. Nathan condemns David. But the thing that David had done displeased Yahweh, and Yahweh sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, "As Yahweh lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of Yahweh to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites? Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says Yahweh, I will rise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives from before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun, for you did it secretly. But I will do this thing before all Israel, and before the sun." David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against Yahweh." Nathan said to David, "Now Yahweh has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned Yahweh, the child that is born to you shall die." Then Nathan went to his house. In this powerful and haunting passage, Nathan forces David to convict himself. The analogy of the story of the rich man and the poor man with the ewe lamb is a parallel to what David had done to Uriah, the ewe lamb being Bathsheba. There are so many capital T truths to be drawn out of this. I'm sure we can all think of situations in our society where the rich or the powerful have exploited the poor or the weak. And there are also many examples of those who have it all. It's just not enough, and they take even more. Think of Bernie Madoff. Think of Robert Mugabe or other politicians who have so much but still fleece more and more from their people, in any country for that matter. And then we have the horrible condemnation, which is so unjust, so unfair that this baby should suffer. David begs God for mercy for this baby's life. The baby is born, and it is horribly ill. David tears his clothes, covers himself in ash, does everything he can to atone, begs, "Please, God, take me. It should be me who died. I'm the one who committed the sin." But David's pleading fall on deaf ears, and after a week of painful existence, the boy dies. This is such a problematic text for me. This is so unjust. It's so wrong. But it holds so many capital T truths. Do people suffer for the sins of their parents? Absolutely. Think of fetal alcohol syndrome. Think of children who are born to parents with addiction, or mothers with addictions that pass those addictions on. Think of parents who are abusive and pass on those traits to their children who grow up to be abusive to their children. People certainly suffer because of what their parents do. And we definitely see this here. In the same way, people suffer for what their world leaders do. When cities are bombed, for every one soldier killed, usually 10 civilians are killed. Think about the implications of what David has done and how that relates to our time. is quite staggering. This is why I love the Bible. Although some parts of it can make me so angry, some parts can be so unpleasant and hard to wrap my head around. They reflect the problems we face and help us to open up conversations in our time about the corruption that we see. Very powerful stuff. I also encourage you to take a look at the questions in blue that I have at the bottom of the first page of Lesson 14. What does this story say about the monarchy in the Juristic historian's context? How can this story relate to today? Did Uriah know? And we talked a bit about that, of how that would change the dynamic of the story. What are your thoughts on that? Is it a good story? Why or why not? What makes it a good story? Well, the question that was raised, David, he's our man. If he can't do it, no one can, has been shown to have the result that David can't. He, the pure, the kind, the humble David, is just as corruptible as anybody else. And to the Juristic historians, that's a real powerful lesson, because the corruption that we see in David is seen in all the subsequent kings of Israel to varying degrees. None of them make it through being a monarch unscathed. And after this, the succession narrative begins. And it starts with the sword indeed being turned on itself within David's house. In David's house, I encourage you to read 2 Samuel 13 to 17 and chapter 13, in which you'll learn about the rape of Tamar. Amnon and Absalom and Tamar are all descendants, children of David. Absalom and Tamar are a full brother and sister, and Amnon is their half-brother. And Amnon, as you'll read, hatches a plot to get his half-sister in the sheets. He's very attracted to her, and he ends up raping her. And after raping her, throwing her out, and basically ruining all prospects for her future prosperity and happiness. Absalom, to exact vengeance, kills Amnon after David fails to act against his rapist son, which leads to a war between Absalom and David, which ends in Absalom's tragic death. And David is again wrecked, crying at the top of the gates, ripping his robes, saying, "Absalom, Absalom, Absalom, why you? Why you, Absalom? Bear that I should be dead, O Absalom." David has some joys in the rest of his life, but really it's a downward spiral. He will always be wrecked by the death of his son with Bathsheba. He will always be wrecked with the treachery that resulted within his house. David is a broken king, and that break will continue throughout his line. Now that you've read this story, I would like you on Blackboard to access the song Hallelujah, written by Leonard Cohen, and you'll find the lyrics on there as well. Please read the lyrics as you listen to the song and answer the questions on the sheet. You're not going to be turning these in, but it's for your own edification. And it'd be a great thing to discuss in the general discussion area of Blackboard if you guys have thoughts on that. You may also find it in the required questions in discussion board for this week as well. But the song is written by Canadian poet, artist, and songwriter Leonard Cohen. But this version is performed by Jeff Buckley, whose picture you see here. Some of you might recognize the song Hallelujah from the movie Shrek, but it very much parallels the story of David and Bathsheba. That's what it's about. And it brings up some interesting ideas. It's a wonderful interpretation of the story. I hope you enjoy.